The silence was deafening when Billboard unveiled their Greatest Legends of All Time list, and the name Sammy Davis Jr. appeared nowhere among the 100 artists celebrated. Within hours, social media erupted into a firestorm of disbelief as musicians, historians, and civil rights advocates demanded answers. How could the man who broke every barrier imaginable, who sacrificed everything to integrate American entertainment, simply vanish from history? The omission felt less like an oversight and more like an erasure. Sammy had been the complete package when most black performers were allowed only one dimension. He sang like an angel, danced like lightning, played instruments with virtuoso skill, and commanded stages with a presence that made even skeptics believers. He'd perform for presidents while being denied entry through the front doors of the venues where he headlined. His marriage to Swedish actress May Britt had sparked death threats and cost him friendships, yet he never stopped pushing boundaries. He'd stood with Martin Luther King Jr. at the March on Washington, then performed in segregated clubs the very next night, using every stage as a battlefield for equality. The entertainment industry's collective memory seemed suddenly selective, conveniently forgetting the shoulders upon which modern diversity stood. Icons like Quincy Jones and Denzel Washington immediately took to their platforms, their words dripping with barely contained fury. They reminded the world that Sammy hadn't just been talented, he'd been revolutionary, courageously performing where no black entertainer had performed before. The question burning in everyone's mind was simple, yet devastating. How do you erase a legend? Who changed everything? Maya Chen had been working late in Billboard's basement archives when her hand brushed against something that shouldn't exist. A cardboard box buried beneath decades of forgotten inventory reports and outdated chart predictions. The label read, Davis Correspondence 1963 to 1969, in faded blue. Inca, and when she lifted the lid, dust particles danced through the single overhead bulb like ghosts demanding attention. Inside lay hundreds of letters, their envelopes yellowed but their passion preserved, each one a time capsule of outrage and devotion that nobody had ever bothered to read. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the first letter, written in elegant cursive by a housewife from Ohio, who described watching Sammy perform through tears, calling him the man who made my children believe they could be anything. Another came from a jazz club owner in Alabama, who detailed how Sammy had insisted on integrated seating, threatening to cancel if black patrons couldn't sit wherever. They chose. Letter after letter revealed the same truth. Sammy had been more than an entertainer. He'd been a revolution wrapped in a tuxedo, tap-dancing his way through hatred with such undeniable brilliance that even bigots found themselves applauding. Maya photographed each letter with shaking hands, her phone's flashlight illuminating words that had waited 6 decades to be witnessed. One envelope contained a child's drawing of Sammy mid-spin, the crayon marks still vibrant, with the words, "My Hero," printed in block letters across the top. These weren't just fan letters, they were testimonies from the front lines of cultural warfare, proof that Sammy's impact had been seismic, immediate and deliberately buried. She sat back against the cold concrete wall, surrounded by voices from the past, and understood with crystalline clarity that she'd just discovered evidence of something far darker than an editorial mistake. Maya's breath caught when she found the telegram buried beneath a stack of unopened envelopes, its Western Union header still crisp despite the decades. The message was typed in aggressive capital letters, each word hammering like a fist on a desk. If you continue erasing Sammy from history while he breaks down doors you refuse to walk through, Billboard will never see my name or my friends' names in your pages again. It was signed, simply, Sinatra, and the date showed it had been sent just 3 days after Billboard published their year-end rankings, without mentioning Sammy's groundbreaking television appearances. She could feel Frank's rage radiating through the paper, the kind of loyalty that risked everything. The telegram's crease marks suggested it had been folded and unfolded many times, as if someone had wrestled with its implications before ultimately burying it in this archive tomb. Maya imagined some terrified editor receiving this threat from the most powerful voice in entertainment. Understanding that standing with Sammy meant standing against the magazine's racist machinery, the choice they made was written in the silence that followed. Billboard never responded, and Frank's threat dissolved into darkness while Sammy continued performing miracles that nobody bothered to document. This single piece of paper proved that even icons had tried to save Sammy's legacy from erasure. She photographed the telegram with reverence, understanding she now held ammunition that could crack open Billboard's carefully constructed mythology. The Rat Pack's most famous member had drawn a line in the sand, choosing brotherhood over business, yet the industry had simply stepped over that line and kept walking. Maya's fingers traced Frank's signature, feeling the weight of a friendship that had demanded justice when justice was still considered radical. This wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a battle cry from the past, finally loud enough to be heard. The Memphis venue reeked of stale bourbon and hatred when Sammy stepped onto that stage in 1966, his patent leather shoes clicking against wood that had never felt a black. Performers wait. Death threats had arrived that morning, crude letters promising violence if he dared perform. But he'd pressed his tuxedo with steady hands, applied his stage makeup like war paint, and walked through a back entrance, flanked by men whose eyes promised murder. The spotlight found him, and the all-white audience sat frozen in hostile silence, their faces twisted into masks of disgust that Maya could almost see in the grainy photographs she'd discovered. Then Sammy began to move, and the laws of physics seemed to bend around his talent. Taps, percussion gunning across the stage, his voice soaring through standards with such technical perfection that prejudice had nowhere to hide. He spun and slid, defying gravity and hatred simultaneously, his body becoming an argument that couldn't be refuted, a brilliance that made bigotry look stupid. Within minutes, feet began tapping beneath tables, and Maya found a witness statement describing how grown men wept openly, their inherited racism crumbling against something stronger than doctrine. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes, captured on a recording Maya had found mislabeled in the archives, the sound of transformation, of souls forced to confront their own capacity for change. Sammy had weaponized excellence, turning a lynching party into believers through nothing but undeniable artistry. That night proved legends aren't born. They're forged in rooms that don't want them to exist. Maya's hands trembled as she pulled the manila folder from the bottom drawer, its edges yellow with decades of concealment. The memo, dated March 1963, bore the Billboard editor-in-chief's letterhead, and the words seemed to burn through the paper. "We can't have too many of them on the list. Advertisers are concerned about the changing face of our publication." Her stomach twisted as she found another, this one circled in red ink, suggesting Sammy's chart positions be adjusted downward to maintain demographic balance, corporate euphemisms for erasure dressed in business language. The E, evidence multiplied like accusations. Ranking sheets with Sammy's name crossed out in angry pen strokes, replacement notes suggesting white performers with half his talent, internal debates about whether his crossover appeal threatened their core readership. Maya discovered a particularly damning exchange where an editor argued Sammy's technical virtuosity was undeniable, only to be overruled by someone who wrote in the margin, "Undeniable doesn't sell in certain markets." They'd systematically diminished a giant to comfort bigots, trading truth for subscription numbers. She photographed every page with shaking fingers, each click of her phone's camera capturing not just documents but confessions of institutional cowardice. The archive's fluorescent lights hummed above her like witnesses, illuminating proof that Sammy hadn't been forgotten. He'd been deliberately buried by men who feared what his excellence represented. Maya pressed the folder to her chest, feeling the weight of responsibility and rage, knowing These pages would finally tell the truth that power had tried to bury. Maya found Marcus Washington in a modest Oakland apartment where gold records lined the walls like memories refusing to fade. The 92-year-old drummer's hands still bore the calluses of decades behind the kit, and when she mentioned Sammy's final interview, his eyes welled with tears that carried 60 years of friendship. He shuffled to an ancient reel-to-reel player, its spools holding what he called the prophecy, and as the tape crackled to life, Sammy's voice filled the room, warm, knowing, heartbreakingly prescient about his own erasure. "They'll try to forget me," Sammy's recorded voice declared with a clarity that defied death, "because I refused to shrink myself to fit their comfort, because I loved who I loved, performed where they said I couldn't, and demanded respect in rooms that wanted me invisible." Marcus closed his eyes, his fingers unconsciously tapping rhythms on his knees as Sammy continued, "But talent leaves evidence, baby. In the dancers I inspired, the barriers I cracked, the stages I integrated with nothing but these 2 feet and this voice." The tape hissed between words, and Maya heard something that broke her. Sammy's quiet laughter, not bitter but defiant, the sound of a man who understood history's cruelty but trusted its ultimate justice. Marcus stopped the recording, his weathered hand trembling on the player, and whispered what Sammy had told him that final day. "Future generations will find the truth, because truth doesn't stay buried when it's built on talent, this undeniable." Maya's article exploded across the internet like a match dropped on gasoline, igniting a cultural firestorm that transcended genres and generations. Within hours, Beyoncé posted a video of herself tap dancing in her studio, captioning it with "Sammy was legend," her feet echoing the rhythms Sammy had pioneered decades before. Justin Timberlake followed with a tearful rendition of one of Sammy's classic performances, his voice cracking as he spoke about borrowed brilliance never acknowledged. The hashtag became a digital resurrection, each post another brick, rebuilding a legacy that powerful hands had tried to demolish. The movement spread like wildfire through every corner of the entertainment world, transforming social media into a sacred space of remembrance and reckoning. Usher choreographed an elaborate tribute with 50 dancers in Las Vegas, their synchronized tapping spelling out Sammy's name on the very stages he'd integrated through sheer determination. Broadway went dark for 3 minutes as performers stood in silence, then erupted into spontaneous tap routines that echoed through Times Square. Even artists who'd never met Sammy felt the ancestral pull of his sacrifice, understanding that every door they walked through he'd kicked open first with bloody knuckles and unshakable dignity. Within 72 hours, the hashtag had been used over 40 million times, creating a tidal wave that crashed against Billboard's marble facade with the force of historical correction. The videos formed a mosaic of gratitude. Young black tap dancers in Detroit, Asian musicians in Seoul, Latinx performers in Mexico City, all claiming Sammy as their spiritual ancestor. The morning sun had barely risen when the first dancers arrived at Billboard's headquarters, their tap shoes slung over their shoulders like weapons of peaceful revolution. They formed a circle on the plaza, silent at first, then began a rhythm that started as a whisper and grew into thunder. An elderly woman in her 70s led them, her feet remembering steps Sammy himself had taught her in a Harlem studio decades ago, each strike against concrete, a defiant declaration that erasure ends today. By noon, thousands surrounded the building, transforming the corporate space into a sacred stage of resistance. Young performers streamed live footage as their shoes sparked against pavement, the sound echoing off glass towers like drums of reckoning. Inside, executives watched from windows as the crowd swelled, their faces pressed against glass that suddenly felt fragile. The dancers moved in waves, creating rhythms so powerful that security guards found their own feet tapping involuntarily, infected by something older than their orders. Major artists began arriving in person, megaphones in hand, their voices amplifying the movement's demands. A Grammy winner shouted that she'd pull every song from Billboard's charts if justice remained delayed. Her words met with roaring approval. Others followed, forming a line of solidarity that stretched 3 blocks, each threatening their silence until Sammy's name received its rightful restoration. The building trembled with consequence. Television cameras captured everything, broadcasting the beautiful siege worldwide as the tapping continued relentlessly, a heartbeat that refused to stop until history bent toward truth. The CEO's hands trembled as he approached the podium, the tap dancing still audible through the reinforced walls like a conscience that wouldn't silence. His prepared statement lay abandoned in his pocket because written words felt cowardly now, insufficient for the magnitude of this reckoning. Behind him stood enlarged photographs of Sammy mid-performance, his body defying gravity, his smile containing both joy and pain. A man who gave everything to stages that didn't always want him. The executive's voice cracked as he began, not with excuses, but with 3 words the world had waited decades to hear. We were wrong. He detailed the creation of the Sammy Davis Jr. Barrier Breakers Award, a permanent tribute to artists who shattered ceilings through undeniable excellence. His voice strengthened as he announced the revised Legends list, Sammy's name now blazing at number 1, not as compensation, but as correction, as historical truth finally documented. Tears streamed down his face as he read testimonials from musicians whose careers existed only because Sammy had kicked down doors while wearing tap shoes and a tuxedo. Outside, the dancing intensified, transformed from protest into celebration. Maya stood among the crowd, watching the screens broadcast the apology worldwide, her journalism degree suddenly feeling like a sacred responsibility rather than mere career. The elderly tap dancer beside her grabbed her hand, squeezing tight, whispering that Sammy would have loved this chaos, this beautiful disruption. The CEO held up the new magazine cover, Sammy's image, commanding the frame, his eyes containing that familiar mixture of defiance and grace. The crowd erupted, their cheers mixing with rhythmic footwork, creating symphony from justice. Maya drove through dawn light to the cemetery, carrying a framed magazine cover that weighed nothing and everything simultaneously. Thousands had already gathered at Sammy's grave, forming circles that stretched across marble and grass, their feet creating rhythms against earth. She knelt before the headstone, placing the frame against cold granite, Sammy's photographed eyes seeming to acknowledge this moment across decades of silence. Around her, performers from every generation tapped tributes into soil that had waited too long to feel this celebration. The elderly drummer stood beside her, his weathered hands keeping time against his thigh, muscle memory of a friendship that transcended mortality. He spoke quietly about Sammy's belief that talent could transform hatred into respect, that excellence demanded recognition even from those determined to withhold it. Maya watched as children mimicked the steps their grandparents demonstrated, legacy transmitting through motion and memory. The morning sun caught the frame's glass, sending light across Sammy's name, finally positioned where truth always insisted it belonged. Simultaneously across continents, crowds gathered in theaters and street or corners, their coordinated performances creating global thunder from countless tapping feet. Videos flooded timelines showing artists of every background, honoring the man who'd endured so others could simply exist. Maya filmed the cemetery gathering, capturing faces wet with tears and bright with vindication, proof that erasure only succeeds until someone refuses to forget. The hashtag continued climbing, each share another nail in injustice's coffin. She touched the headstone gently, whispering gratitude to a legend who'd trusted strangers like her to excavate buried truth. The crowd's dancing intensified, transforming grief into defiant joy, exactly as Sammy would have choreographed it. His story now belonged to history properly told, inspiration for anyone fighting to be seen. Some legends don't fade, they simply wait for courage to restore them. Who in your life deserves to be remembered and celebrated? Subscribe to hear more stories of forgotten heroes reclaiming their rightful place in history.